Hey everyone, Mr. Harvey here. Let's get started. We are starting a new chapter today, ladies and gentlemen, chapter 17. And in chapter 17, we are going to be talking about imperialism. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on the imperialism, this new imperialism that we are seeing in the 1800s and early 1900s. So let's get into it. Now, the country who really is going to personify this, this new imperialism, this new age of imperialism that we're going to be talking about in the 1800s and early 1900s is Great Britain. Britain is going to have this grand empire, this grand British empire. The sun will never set upon this British empire, and they're really the symbolic European country during this age of imperialism. That's not to say that other countries, other European countries, are not going to get involved. They will. We're going to see Germany get involved. We will see France get involved. Spain, Portugal, Netherlands are going to be involved as well. However, Belgium's going to be involved. However, Britain is really the symbol of this 1800s and early 1900s age of imperialism in the country that on a DBQ, LEQ, SAQ, we should really be thinking about when it comes to imperialism. Okay, now let's get into it. Now, before we get into this age of new imperialism that we're going to be talking about throughout this chapter, ladies and gentlemen, I want to focus on old imperialism. There's a definite contrast between the imperialism that we've talked about so far with the imperialism that we are about to talk about. Okay, and this old imperialism, if you remember, occurred between the 16th and 18th centuries, 1500s, kind of through the 1700s, and we don't really see Europe acquiring territory in Africa and Asia, and Africa and Asia are not really the epicenter or the focus of this imperialism. All right, we do see some territorial acquisition, Britain in India. We're going to see Portugal establishing trading posts in India, West Africa, Indonesia. The Netherlands will be in Indonesia, but Europeans in Asia typically respected and cooperated with local rulers, but it was a completely different story in the Americas, if we remember this, right? We saw mass colonization, territorial takeover, the indigenous who had that territory they'll be murdered, enslaved, their communities, their ways of life will be destroyed. America's very different story from what we saw within Africa and Asia in old imperialism. Okay, and you should be familiar with where the European countries colonized and kind of created those mercantile empires, right? Britain with the East Coast, the 13 colonies, France and Canada. Most of the European powers will have territory in the Caribbean. Portugal will have territory in Brazil. Spain with New Spain will have territory from all the way from Argentina to California, right? We know this. We've talked about this. Those colonial empires, all right? The era of this early modern European expansion saw conflict between the European powers for dominance in the Americas, especially North America. We saw the establishment of those trading posts, which I talked about, Dutch dominance in Indonesia, and British dominance in India. So these are just characteristics of old imperialism, ladies and gentlemen, that we should be familiar with and that we've talked about. Okay? But the collapse of these European powers, Spain, Portugal, and France, as colonial powers, really left Britain as Europe's most powerful imperialist nation. And then we're going to see Britain kind of add to that with new imperialism, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Okay? Now, between the mid-1700s, 18th century, and early 19th century, 1800s, we're going to see a huge transformation in European overseas territories, right? France is going to lose a lot of its North American empire in the 7 Years' War. Britain is going to lose the East Coast in the American Revolution. The Caribbean islands are going to kind of go back and forth between the European countries. Spain and Portugal, we've talked about this, are going to lose the vast majority of their imperial holdings. And another large difference that we're going to see between the 19th century empires and early imperialism is going to be slavery. The slave trade is going to be going away with the Enlightenment. It's going to be abolished in Great Britain in 1807. And Great Britain is going to work to close down the slave trade of other nations during the 19th century. And so we're really going to see slavery, that form of African slavery, largely disappear from European empires. That doesn't mean it's going to completely go away, but to a large extent it will. Also, another difference that we're going to be seeing is Roman missionary Catholics, which were defined this early imperialism of the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. We're going to see more Protestant missionaries in the 1800s and 1900s. So just some contrast, some differences that we're going to be seen with old and new imperialism. Okay, and I suggest you all make a chart, a Venn diagram, maybe some similarities and differences between the two, because there definitely are similarities and differences, and we're going to get into that. Now, during the first half of the 19th century, Great Britain is going to have influence and power all over the world and seek to expand that influence and power all over the world. I mean, Britain, we are going to see in the 1800s and 1900s, Britain, we know the Industrial Revolution is going on. We know the Agricultural Revolution is going to going on. When it comes to foreign policy, Great Britain is simply going to try to seek to expand their economic power throughout the world. They have power and territory in Canada during this time, in Australia during this time, in New Zealand during this time, and a lot of power and influence in India during this time. They have colonies in the Caribbean, and the Pacific, and the Indian Oceans. And up until the 1860s and 1870s, except in India and Western Canada, Great Britain is not really going to seek to add additional territory, but one of their main priorities, ladies and gentlemen, is imperialism of free trade. Now, it's going to change after the 1860s and 1870s. They're going to want some additional territory, but one of the things that really characterizes Great Britain in the early 1800s, ladies and gentlemen, is imperialism of free trade, a place for them to sell their stuff. Why? Well, what's going on in Great Britain during that time, early 1800s, ladies and gentlemen, mid 1800s? The Industrial Revolution. They want a place to be able to sell their goods and trade their goods. All right, they are that workshop of the world, and they want a place to sell their goods. All right. So they wanted to introduce their goods freely to people of other nations, and they wanted to try to establish economic dominance in and throughout the world. Okay, so let's continue talking about the imperialism of free trade. So 19th century Great Britain is going to start to replace that old mercantile thought, that notion of mercantilism, with capitalism in their economy. Okay, that notion of bullions, increasing trade at the expense of another nation, right? The government controlling the economy. Mercantilism is out, and we are seeing, along with the Industrial Revolution, capitalism start to take hold in Great Britain, wanting to sell their stuff, wanting to let business kind of go off and sell their stuff. All right, very important. So you combine that, like I said, combine capitalism with Great Britain's Industrial Revolution, and Great Britain is becoming this workshop of the world, and they're going to produce a lot of goods, and they want to sell those goods to the world, and they're going to start to produce a majority of the world's goods. Now, we know that later on in the 1800s, Germany is going to be challenging them and eventually overtake them as the economic giant within Europe. But this is early 1800s, and we're seeing this transition from old imperialism to new imperialism, and it kind of in the middle of this time period of old imperialism to new imperialism, we're seeing Great Britain with this imperialism of free trade trying to dominate the world market when it comes to selling their goods. All right. And so Great Britain wanted little government interference in the form of tariffs, price controls, and other regulations, and they wanted to sell their goods. And a great example of Britain really trying to control markets and are motivated to intervene in other countries, and motivated to gain power, and this economic motivation for imperialism and power is going to be seen in the Opium Wars. Okay, and we're going to see this notion of being able to trade and sell their stuff, this economic motivation of imperialism, this economic motivation of asserting control in other areas. It's going to lead to war, and we're going to see that with the Opium Wars. Britain wanted to trade for Chinese goods, but the Chinese did not want opium because of how addictive it is, and Britain is going to go to war to impose the free trade of opium, to try to sell opium, to be able to trade opium and sell it in China. And they're going to go to war with the Chinese in China in order to have this ability to trade. So this economic motivation, that's what I'm trying to get at, ladies and gentlemen, this huge economic motivation for this imperialism of free trade. And Great Britain, in the First War, they're going to receive Hong Kong. They're not necessarily trying to take over China. They're really trying to and take their territory. They want to be able to trade and control the Chinese economy. So they're going to receive Hong Kong, which is an important port. They're going to force the Chinese to allow Christianity into China. They're going to open ports to the British. And British merchants are not going to be subject to Chinese law, but British law while they're in China, so they don't have to obey the Chinese law. In the Second War, Great Britain is going to ally with France and win more concessions from the Chinese, and they're going to force the Chinese to establish embassies in Beijing, open more ports and areas to foreign trade, and permit more freedom for Christianity to continue to spread, throughout China. Now, also during this time, and so Britain is really all over the place. They're going to be in Asia. They're going to be all throughout the world. And they're going to also oversee the development and economic development and settlement of three major regions. That's going to be Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And they're going to really establish power and control and hegemony over these areas. They're going to win Canada through warfare, which we have talked about, especially in the 7 Years' War. Australia is going to be settled as a colony for British convicts, and we're going to see missionaries lead the colonization of New Zealand. But Britain is going to be taking and establishing its power there. So not only is Great Britain in India establishing power, they're trying to establish that economic power of free trade over parts of Asia, but they're also establishing power in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And we're going to see the settlement of these lands attract millions of migrants from Great Britain, but all throughout Europe. And these regions are going to develop self-government based on British law and structure, and be a part of the British Commonwealth. All right, and here is a picture from the Opium Wars, showcasing the fighting between the Chinese and the British. And the British with their advanced weaponry. We're going to be talking about the advanced weaponry, steamboats, guns, machine guns. The Chinese did not have the advanced weaponry, and so they will lose. They will be losing in those wars. Now, the crown jewel of the British Empire, the epicenter of Britain's focus when it comes to imperialism, and there's a lot of different areas that they're focusing on. Remember, they're so motivated by economics. They are that mercantile empire. What I mean by mercantile is they are that empire. They're a seaborne empire of merchants, and really, remember, controlling the oceans ever since 1588. And the oceans, controlling all that trade, is so important for this island nation. And so they are this ocean-going empire. And their crown, and they're all over the place. And their crown jewel, that really the epicenter, is going to be focused on India. And so we're going to see Britain kind of shift away from the Atlantic to the Asian, Indian, and Pacific Oceans, especially when they lose the 13 colonies in the American Revolution. And they're going to gain control of India at the same time as they start to lose the American colonies. And remember, I believe I talked about this. I don't know. I've had so many lectures. But remember, when Great Britain loses the American colonies, they really don't see it as a big deal. It is a big deal, but it's not. Obviously they've lost and they've been embarrassed on the world stage by the American revolutionaries. But the British are also, remember, very motivated by economics, and they're gaining control of India at the same time. So they're going to be very much like, okay, we lost America, but we're getting this huge territory and influence in India at the same time. And they're going to be very happy about that. All right. They're going to control India until the 1940s, after World War II. And eventually this Indian territory is going to become India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And this is going to be their most important territory within the British Empire. It's going to be a center for their military and economic power in Asia, and it's going to be very important to them. Now, there's a lot of challenges for the British Empire when they are trying to gain control of India. Number one, it's this very vast, diverse population that do not necessarily share British values. A lot of different cultural notions within India. There's a very complex and social, economic conditions, cultural conditions that the British had a hard time understanding. They were dominated by non-Western religions, predominantly Islam and Hinduism. And technically, when Britain is going to start to establish power over India, they were ruled by the Mughal Empire, but that empire had been, greatly weakened. Um, and it's going to be Britain is going to really take advantage of that weakness to gain control and hegemony within India. Britain is going to gain control of India through a private company called the East India Company during the 1600s, and I want you to make sure you highlight that, ladies and gentlemen. It was chartered by Parliament, and it's going to gain power through warfare and negotiation, and they're going to lead armies of Indian soldiers guided by British officers called sepoys to help fight on behalf of the British. But we're going to see some serious issues when it comes to British rule in India, and the biggest challenge for Great Britain in India is going to be with the Sepoy Rebellion. All right, and we'll talk about that. Now, Britain and the East India Company is going to see India as a place for economic exploitation. Britain is going to establish more of a governmental and cultural presence in India, and they're going to start to actually challenge a lot of Indian culture and customs. English is going to be the official language in India. They're going to prohibit specific Indian practices such as the sati, and we're going to see, and this is very much linked to racism, social Darwinism, this civilizing mission where they believe that they're going to bring civilization to India. But Great Britain is going to be really challenged in India with the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. And this is going to represent their greatest kind of threat and challenge as they are gaining control of India. And that's going to be in 1857, where you see this massive rebellion against the British within the Indian army, those mercenaries, the sepoys. And it started with the notion that the cartridges for British muskets were coated with beef, not beet, it should say beef, or pork fat. And that was a huge cultural insult and problem for the sepoys and the people of India, especially the Indian army who were using those muskets, because the cow is a sacred animal to the Hindu, and the pigs were considered very unclean to Muslims. And they this rumor that was started was really insulting to the sepoys in the Indian army, and so we're going to see a massive rebellion break out over this rumor. The Indians were also very unhappy with the unequal pay and the discrimination they faced, and also being forced to convert to Christianity. And the sepoys will lose, but this is really going to force Great Britain to make some changes, and we're going to see the India Act of 1858 will transfer power from the East India Company to the British Crown. And we're going to see a lot of the company officials within the East India Company become administrators to the British Crown. And Britain is going to start to refrain from efforts to change India, refrain from efforts to interfere in religious matters, and work more closely with Indian rulers. But again, this shows you, ladies and gentlemen, the importance of India to Great Britain, this crown jewel. All right. In 1877, Queen Victoria will be declared the Empress of India. All right, and here's a picture from the Sepoy Rebellion. All right. Now, we're going to see eventually a movement of Indian nationalism and independence, and we'll be seeing that throughout the late 1800s, throughout the 1900s, eventually coming to fruition in the mid 20th century, and we'll be talking about that. But in 1885, the Hindus are going to found the Indian National Congress with goals of modernizing Indian life. We're going to see the Muslim League seek an independent Muslim state, which eventually will become Pakistan. And after World War I, we're going to see Indian nationalism grow, and officially India, eventually they will achieve their independence in the 1940s after World War II. All right, and we will be looking at that later on in this class. But you can see, ladies and gentlemen, just the British India in 1820, British India in 1856. You're going to see, Britain establish a lot of power over India during this time. All right, let's stop there for today, ladies and gentlemen. In the next lecture, I'm going to be focusing on new imperialism, and we're going to be making more of that contrast from old imperialism and discussing the advances of new imperialism during the 1800s and early 1900s. Thank you so much.